Hello, how are you? And thank you very much for downloading my first podcast. This is Oliver Williams, and I am the webmaster for johntitor.com. And for those of you who are not familiar with John Titor, I'll try to give you a little bit of history. John Titor was a self-proclaimed time traveler who visited our time from the year 2036, and in the year 2000, John Titor went online into an internet forum and started posting that he was a time traveler and started answering questions and making predictions, talking about physics and the future and what was in store for us. And this was back in 2000. He was here for about 3 months, actually 4 months. It was November to March of 2001, at which point he said he was leaving, and he left. And no one has heard from him since then. If you search the internet now, just do a Google search for John Titor, and you will see thousands of websites and blogs and videos now and pictures talking about John Titor, and you can find out more about him. Well, you may be wondering how I got involved in all of this. I'm not a kook. I don't 100% believe that John Titor is a real time traveler. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I keep following it. It goes on and off. Sometimes I'll see things in the news, and it'll absolutely bewilder me and make me crazy, and then there'll be other times, long stretches, where I won't pay any attention to it at all. And I got involved back in 2002 after John apparently left, and a friend of mine had been reading all the posts from all the different sites, and I said, you got to check this out. This time travel guy is telling this very strange story, and you got to read this. So I did. I started reading it, and like a lot of other people, I stayed up all night and read all the posts. The one thing that caught me right away in the post was that John talked about how his time machine worked. He said that the power that made his time machine work was derived from 2 micro black holes that were created at CERN, which is a particle accelerator in Geneva, Switzerland. And while he was here, he said that soon CERN would make an announcement later that year that they expected to be able to, or plan to, somehow create these in the laboratory once the accelerator was finished. And of course what caught my eye was that's exactly what happened. September 2001, CERN did indeed make that announcement. And that was the first thing that caught me, where I said there might be something more to it than just some guy on the internet pretending to be a time traveler. So of course I started reading all the posts again, trying to find something else. In going back to the posts, what happened was it was very difficult to go from site to site. So I started editing and taking the posts and putting them all in one spot, and that's how johntitor.com got started. Since then, I've tried to put news stories up there that relate to stuff that John said while he was here, and that's how the site got started, and that's how I got involved. Since then, I guess I've become sort of the John Titor spokesperson. I've been on Coast to Coast with George Norrie, which is a fantastic show, by the way. I've been on there, how many times? Probably 6 or 7 times now since 2004. And every now and then, when time travel or physics comes up on George's show, he'll mention something about John Titor. Okay, why does John Titor draw so much attention? Of course, back in 2000, 2001, he was here. He made a bunch of statements online, responding to people's questions. And a lot of things that he said then, nobody really paid much attention to. It was a weird guy on the internet saying some strange things. And now later on, we look back at what he said, and here are some of the things that a lot of people point to that draw a lot of attention to themselves. John spoke many times about war in the Middle East, and he made a statement that there would be no WMDs found in the Second Iraqi War. And keep in mind, this is before 9/11. This is around February 25th, 2001 is when he made that statement. February 19th, 2001, he said China would be the next to put a man in orbit. We shouldn't be surprised that happens soon. In October of 2003, that's exactly what happened. It wasn't Japan, it wasn't France, it was China. And John said that was going to happen. What else we got here? He talked many times about problems with space shuttles. He said that Stephen Hawking would change his theory about mini black holes, which some people feel that he did. So those are just a few things that John spoke about. And if you want to read the post yourself, you can either go to my site, do a Google search for John Titor, look it up yourself, and you can read it. So why was John here? John claims to have been a soldier in the year 2036 who was sent on a mission back to 1975 to get a computer that was manufactured by IBM called the 5100. And this computer was a small computer, it was a desktop compared to the other computers then, and it fit on a tabletop. And according to John, this computer had special properties that IBM had built into it that they were aware of in the future, that they needed to, solve some problem in the future. The interesting thing about this is that after John left, some IBM engineers did come forward who had worked on the 5100, saying that John was absolutely right, that the things that he claimed were built into it, IBM did indeed build in there, and they did not make it known to the public. And that only a handful of people would have known about this. So either John was a real time traveler, or he was one of these people that knew about this function of the computer. A lot of people point to this and say, that disqualifies him as being a time traveler right away. It's a silly notion that they would send somebody back. If they had the ability to build a time machine, why would they need to go back and get an old computer? And the interesting thing about that is if you look now, in fact, there's a story on our website, this is a while ago, NASA scours eBay looking for computer parts for their space shuttles. So the idea of having to go back to old equipment to repair or fix new equipment is not really that stupid of an idea. So it is plausible that that could be a reason why someone would travel in time. So now we'll move to the news section of my podcast. And one of the things that we do on our site is people send me links to news stories, or I'll find other stories myself that are about things John spoke about when he was here in 2000, 2001 that are happening now. And this one is an interesting one. While John was talking to people online, he was asked a question about poetry. Did he remember any poetry from the future that he could share with us? And he did. He said there was a poem called A Soldier's Winter. And he read a few lines from the poem, and it goes like this. The day before, it wasn't snowing. The trees are strangers, leering, disapproving in the ash of winter. My world, my life, my wandering path. I pray God's eyes may once again gaze upon me and remind me that I am still his child. So those were the words of the poem that John could remember. And again, it's important to realize that he wrote that in 2000, 2001. So now, the news story, which is a retired Army colonel named Larry Cluck, has written a poem in 2005 entitled A Soldier's Winter. And this is one of the lines from his poem. Each day now of the coming season seems to be getting shorter and shorter. Sunrises and sunset seem closer and closer together. Winter is approaching much too fast. All my skills, all my training, all my abilities as a soldier can't stop it. All we can do is have memories of the past. Now, even though the poems have the same title and the same types of ideas in them, John says this about his poem. He says, I only think I remember the first line, but not the last one. It was quite a few more lines that I don't remember. So he's talking about the poem that he just read. He doesn't remember it too well. It is rumored this was written first as a letter by a soldier. After he died, it was added to and edited by others. So now we have two poems, same title, one written in 2005, one John is talking about in the future, and the one he's talking about was edited. John goes on to say, in my opinion, it has become a symbol for the collective guilt of my parents' generation for what became of the world. So now the question. Is the poem A Soldier's Winter that was written by Larry Cluck in 2005 the same poem John was referring to in the year 2001 after he had heard it in the future and was talking about it with us then. Another question that John was asked had to do with medicine. He was asked, do medical advances in 2036 have anything to do with genetics? And John answers, again, I'm no expert. I believe there is a great deal of progress in treating the cancer cells with modified viruses, so I guess the answer is yes. In the news, cancer-fighting virus shows promise in early clinical trial. A virus that has been specifically designed by scientists to be safe to normal tissue but deadly to cancer is showing early promises in preliminary study. Researchers said at the ESMO conference in Switzerland. The virus called NV1020 is a type of herpes simplex virus modified so that it selectively replicates in virus cells, killing them in the process. So again, are these the types of treatments and progress that John was referring to? And here's another story in the news. This one is dated August 2nd, 2007, and the title is Back to the Future via a Donut-Shaped Vacuum. A physicist from the Technion Israeli Institute of Technology in Haifa has come up with what he says are practical solutions to overcome the hindrances that experts have long regarded as stopping us from traveling back in time. The details of the research are so complicated as to be baffling, of course. In a 2004 paper, the research outlines a set of conditions that would allow for the creation of a time loop without the need for exotic matter. According to the theory, the time loop would form as a donut-shaped vacuum inside which time would curve back on itself, so that a person traveling around the loop might be able to go further back in time with each lap. A sphere containing a non-exotic but unidentified matter would in turn surround the loop. Now the reason this story is interesting is because one of the things John did while he was here was he spoke at great length in detail about the physics of how his time machine worked. And this is dated February 14th, 2001. This is from John's post, and he was describing the steps of how his time machine worked. And what he wrote was, rotating black hole equals donut-shaped singularity. Fortunately, most black holes are not static. They spin. Spinning black holes are often referred to as Kerr black holes. A Kerr black hole has two interesting properties. One, they have two event horizons. And two, the singularity is not a point, it looks like a donut. These odd properties also have a pronounced effect on black holes' gravity. There are vectors where you can approach the singularity without being crushed by the gravity. Now, it's odd that, maybe a coincidence, that they both use the shape of a donut to describe how that works. But something even more interesting is, of course, John stated all this in 2001, and is it just now that scientists are getting around to figuring this out in 2004? The last story that I have is about the Olympic Games in China in 2008. And the reason I bring this up is because one of the major criticisms against John has been one of the statements he made about the Olympics. He said that there would be no official Olympics after 2004. And, of course, the Olympic Games in 2006 went off without a hitch. So a lot of people point to that and say, aha, see, he was not a real time traveler. In my opinion, there are other things John said which should be taken into account when considering that, but that is one of the major criticisms against the posts. But here's an interesting story. Waters wants to boycott Beijing Olympics. Representative Maxine Waters, a Democrat from California, introduced a resolution as Congress prepares to break for the August recess Saturday, urging President Bush to boycott the 2008 Olympics in China. Waters and others involved in the effort to end the humanitarian crisis in Darfur, where an estimated 200,000 people have died and millions more are homeless, want to pressure China to curtail its support of the Sudanese government. So it's possible that there may be enough of a buildup that we boycott the 2008 Olympics in China, thus possibly proving the statement that John made to be true, that there won't be any more official Olympics after 2004, that we're not going to be there in 2008. Something to consider. All right, this next section of the podcast, I'd like to concentrate on one or two subjects that John specifically spoke about in his posts. And this first one is going to be about the nature of time and how time travel works. John was asked repeatedly, many times, about how his time machine worked and how time worked. And in other podcasts, I'll talk about how the time machine works, or how John said the time machine worked. And I just want to talk now about what he said, how time worked. John said, and these are his exact words, "Temporal space-time is made up of every possible quantum state. The Everett-Wheeler model is correct. I have and/or seen myself twice on different world lines. Every possible thing that can happen or will happen has already happened somewhere. I like to think of it as standing in a room with mirrors on the walls. I can look to my right and left and see many me's all doing exactly the same thing. If we all took a step to our right and passed through a dimensional doorway to the next mirrored room, it would be very difficult to tell if anything had changed. In that sense, there are an infinite number of world lines waiting for me to return. If I can get to one of them, I have completed my mission." So basically what John was talking about there was about how time travel works, and one of the interesting things about his post is that instead of using the word timeline, John used the word world lines. So others go on to ask, how is our world line different from yours? John answers, "For starters, the fact that I'm here makes it different. I've also noticed little things like news events that happen at different times, football games won by other teams, things like that. I would guess the temporal divergence between this world line and my original is about 1 or 2%. Of course, the longer I am here, the larger that divergence becomes from my point of view." So what John is saying is that when you travel back in time, you actually go to some other world line or some other alternate universe that looks very much like yours, and it changes as you're there, or it's a little different just because you are there. So someone goes on to ask him this question: if this world line is 2% divergent from your world line, how do you get home? If you go forward from here to 2036, won't the divergence approach infinity? Yes, says John, this is true. If I go forward on this world line, the future will not be my future. I get home by going back to 1975, before I arrived, and then going forward to 2036. It is possible to go forward to your 2036, but it would look nothing like mine. So what John is saying is that once you travel around in time, in order to get back home, he's got to go back to his point of origin where he first arrived, so that his future is in our future, so it looks different. Another question: when you time travel, you can never actually go back to the exact place you left from? John says, this is correct. In physical terms, I can never get back to the exact world line I left. So the fact that you're using the time machine, says John, means you're going around changing the past and the present, and you never get back to the exact place that you left. Another question: if you leave your world line, some of your friends and family members will never see you again. John answers, it depends on how you define what the real me is. If you consider the mirror example again, as all of the me's step from one room to the right, the family and friends in that room, and the time traveler for that matter, would not be able to tell the difference. The probability of us noticing a difference is based on the divergence of the trip. If all events and outcomes are certain, there are world lines where I do return for every world line that I don't return. Question: isn't it possible someone who reads this may invent time travel? When John leaves, no one will remember him, and this will all be forgotten. John replies, this statement is quite insightful. One of the reasons I have been communicating this way is so that others that do not post who I have directed here can see some of the information I have shared with you. Okay, I want to refer now to the August 8th Coast to Coast show with George Norrie. This is 2007. And the guest was Ron Mallett. And for those of you who don't know who Ronald Mallett is, he is a PhD, the professor of physics at the University of Connecticut. And he's been in the news lately also, if you look him up with a Google. He claims to be researching a real time machine, which involves the bending of light rays to create a shift in time-space that he thinks you can actually measure whether or not time travel works. And he was on the George Norrie show, and George Norrie asked him about the possibility of John Titor being a real time traveler. As any scientist would probably do in front of the public, Dr. Mallett said no, he did not believe John was a time traveler. But it was the reason that he gave that surprised me. Mr. Mallett said that in order to believe it, he would have to see the machine, and that his theory is based on real science. I find this answer from Dr. Mallett interesting for a couple of reasons. First off, seeing the time machine may not really be what he means. In fact, John did show us pictures of his machine online, or at least some sort of machine, and I don't think that changed anybody's mind. In fact, everybody started arguing over the validity of the pictures. What I think Dr. Mallett really meant was that he wanted to touch the machine, or he wanted to be near the machine, or maybe even that he really wanted to use it himself to go back in time. And if you think about it, that may be the only way a time traveler could ever prove that he's really who he says he is to allow you to use his machine to go back in time. The interesting thing is that how does Dr. Mallett expect anyone to believe him if he's successful in creating his time machine? Would he have to let someone use it or see it? Imagine an astronaut trying to convince Dr. Mallett that he went to the moon. Would Dr. Mallett ask him, I don't believe you, I want to see the ship that you used to actually go there? Or would he actually have to go to the moon himself in order to believe it? Again, I guess this goes back to a fundamental question, which is, how do you prove you're a time traveler? And I submit that traveling in time with the person you're trying to convince is probably the only way to do it. So if that's the case, then based on what John has said about time travel and what Ronald Mallett has said about time travel, that the fact that you use the machine changes the time that you're in, and that it's possible to meet yourself and to alter events, and that you can never get back to where you started from, then it's impossible to convince somebody that you're a time traveler. Because taking them for a ride means they'll never get back to their friends to tell them, hey, I was just hanging out with a time traveler, since they're going to take them to a different reality anyway. On top of that, I can't imagine that whoever you would show your time machine to wouldn't want to take it from you or to continue to use it, and that would present its own set of problems. So I guess I would urge Dr. Mallett to think more about that, since he's planning on becoming a real time traveler himself someday. The other reason I think Dr. Mallett's answer is interesting is he mentions the science, or, as I suspect what he really means, is the lack of science in what John was saying. However, I can't help but notice the similarities between what I just read you, John said, and some of the things Dr. Mallett said on the Coast to Coast show about how he believes time travel works. For example, he said quantum theory backs up everything that he's talking about, that our universe is one of many parallel universes where all possibilities that could happen are being played out, that time travel into the past is possible without a paradox, because what you're doing is going back to another parallel universe where you're changing the time in the past because you're there. He also made statements such as, alternate history that you go back to is very close to the one that you left, and it would appear the same to you, and that you could never go home again due to the fact that traveling around in time changes things slightly. So I guess my point is, if you go to Dr. Mallett's own website and look up some of the research articles and papers and the times he's been in the media, you'll notice that his entry into that started around 2002, which was shortly after the time John Titor left. Is it possible that one of the people John was referring to, that he showed his site to and was hoping that he was reading it, could have been Dr. Mallett? For example, after listening to the Coast to Coast show, I definitely got the impression that Dr. Mallett is looking for funds to build a model of his time machine. And he's not the only one. There's another physicist at the University of Washington named Dr. Kramer, and he's also looking for funds to build a time machine. In fact, I think he just got funds from the Department of Defense to build his time machine. And again, if you go back and look at what Dr. Kramer is saying, it's very similar to what John was saying 7 years ago. So, taking all this into account, you tell me, is it even a little strange that reputable physicists looking into time travel are echoing exactly the same things John stated 7 years ago and are now out looking for funds to build real time machines? And at the same time, they are denying that John Titor is real, that he has any validity, that anything he said could possibly be true, and then they turn around and say exactly the same things. I hope you enjoyed my first attempt at a podcast. Again, I very much appreciate the fact that you spent the time to listen to this and to download it. If you want more information about John Titor, I'm going to try to post more podcasts as more news and more developments happen. And I would urge you to take a look at our site, johntitor.com, JOHNTITOR.com. Also, if you do a Google search, you'll find many other sites that talk about John. The first website that he appeared on was called the Time Travel Institute, and that's another fine website where there are many discussions going on about time travel. I would also urge you to try the anomalies.com site, which is another good site for time travel and paranormal issues. And also to go to the Coast to Coast with George Norrie site and do a search for John Titor, and you can find all my old shows there, as well as many other subjects about time travel and paranormal activity. So I hope this isn't the last time that you listen to me. And again, I want to say thank you, and goodbye.